That's rule one. And, rule two, I talk to people about taking care of themselves like there's someone who they have responsibility for. And that's not a political issue too. It's an injunction to assuming that you have a certain intrinsic value, and that it's necessary for that value to manifest itself, for you to push yourself against the world, to challenge yourself, because otherwise what you're capable of won't manifest itself. It has to be developed. It has to be called forth by necessity, right? You have to pick a hard problem and try to solve it and push yourself against it and you have to try to do that truthfully and responsibly in order for what it is that you're intrinsically capable of and composed of to come to the forefront. And that seems like a very positive thing as far as I'm concerned, to encourage people to be responsible for themselves and for other people, and also to point out that you have a moral responsibility to do so for yourself just as you do for others. And I think that message has been very helpful to people. At least that's what they've told me. And it's predicated, the rule is predicated on the old Judeo-Christian idea, the oldest idea in some sense, that that there's a relationship between logos, which is truthful speech and communication, and bringing things into being from chaotic potential. That's the idea that's put forward in Genesis. And also the idea that men and women alike are made in the image of God, which suggests that, like God, we have the capability of affecting potential, affecting the possible future, and turning it into the actual present, and that we do that, at least in part, as a consequence of our ethical choices. And then I'll give you one more example. In Rule 10, which is be precise in your speech, I point out that that the aims that you have in your life, the ethical aims, and those are the aims that direct your actions, also direct your perceptions, that this is true at a neurophysiological level, and that much of the way that the world manifests itself to you is a consequence of the structure of your ethics. So it's your ethical structure that's instantiated neurophysiologically that serves as an intermediary between the world of phenomena, let's say objective phenomena, and your perception of that. And you see the world through an ethical lens. And one of the things that suggests, and I outlined this in Rule 6, is that if the world looks to you like a dismal and terrible place, and you're nihilistic and depressed and hopeless and all of that, I mean, there can be physiological reasons for that. You might be ill, but if it's a psychological issue, it's certainly possible that at least part of the reason that everything appears to you in that light is because your ethical structure is not well formulated. It's incoherent, it's nihilistic, it isn't predicated on the idea, for example, that people have some spark of divine virtue, and that everyone is valuable in that right, and that we all have the possibility to make a genuine contribution to the world, or at least to stop it from degenerating any more than it has to into a kind of hell. So anyways, that's a very long answer to that question. But it's so interesting to me that the journalists who interview me have no curiosity about why it is that so many people are coming to watch my lectures. It's like the curiosity has been boiled out of them in some sense, because it certainly makes me curious. Every time I go on stage and there's 3,500 people there, I'm curious about why they're there. And so we have a discussion about all these things that I've been talking about. And I can tell you too that the one thing that really brings the house to dead silence, which is very much worth paying attention to, is the discussion. Anytime I have a discussion about the relationship between responsibility and meaning, because one of the fundamental theses of 12 Rules for Life, and also of Maps of Meaning, is that because life is essentially tragic in its fundamental essence, you need a sustaining meaning that's deep and profound, and deep and profound enough to get you through bad times, because there will be very bad times in your life. There'll be death, and there'll be illness, and There'll be disappointment of all sorts. And there'll be just the standard difficulties of life in the world to contend with. And you really must have something that's profound and powerful to set up against that. And I think that your voluntary adoption of the struggle to improve being is the proper antidote to that. And that the best way to do that is to live responsibly and truthfully. I truly believe that. And I think that people know this, because when I talk to my audiences about exactly this, about who they admire, for example, it's like, well, you don't admire people who lie and cheat and deceive. You don't teach your children to do that. You admire people who keep their word, who are honest and reliable, and you want them around, especially in times of trouble. And you want people who are capable of being responsible for themselves and to take care of themselves properly, as if they matter, as a moral duty. And then you also want people who have extended themselves past that so that they can take care of their family and regard that as a noble and appropriate enterprise, and who are reliable for their children and for their husbands and wives. And then you want people who are capable of extending themselves even beyond that and taking care of the community. And when I talk about that, and that's meaning, it's where you find the meaning in your life if you're looking for it. It's not in happiness, and it's not an impulsive pleasure. None of that works for any length of time. And it tends to kick back hard. And it's certainly not something that's going to get you through rough times. It's the ability to pick up a heavy load of responsibility and to move forward with it. And what's so interesting is that every time I talk about this with my audiences, they're reduced to complete silence. And I think there's something, and that's, I've noticed that in 150 different cities now. And it's something you really have to take seriously when you see it happening over and over. And I do believe that a huge part of the reason that people are coming to watch my lectures and to buy my book, the lectures, of course, have more direct impact on me than the book sales, although the book sales now have approached 3 million copies, which is quite something in hardcover around the world. And they're not translated into all the languages they're going to be translated into. That's, I think, 50 languages is what they're slated for now. But the lectures have more impact on me because I get to see the audience and then to talk to people afterwards, and they tell me the same thing. Many people who come up to me in the meet and greets, because people can come and talk to me after the lecture. There's special tickets arranged for that. That's handled by a particular company. And they tell me, they've been trying to develop a vision for their life and to act more responsibly and to speak more truthfully and to take more responsibility. Maybe I already said that. And that the changes in their lives have been overwhelming as a consequence. Merely trying to just speak the truth or not lie has had a huge effect on many of the people that I've talked to. And it's not a simple thing to do, and it's a risky thing because the consequences of speaking the truth in the short term, especially if you're not very practiced at it, can be quite devastating, which is, of course, why people don't do it. But the medium to long-term consequences are extremely beneficial, and it's what sets the world straight. And so, what question are you asked way too seldom? Well, Dr. Peterson, don't you think that it's interesting that so many people are coming to your lectures that are fundamentally psychological and philosophical in nature, and apparently doing so because they're really trying hard to get their lives together? It's like, yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it's a question that's really worth pursuing. It's the only question that's worth pursuing as far as I'm concerned, because it's a real mystery that there's such a demand for this. I can't fathom it. I think it's been a source of tremendous optimism to me that people have that burning desire for a more profound dialogue. And, it's not necessarily the people that you expect to. So the journalists, they're very cynical about my hypothetically angry audience, for example. And, I've spoken now to, I think, 350,000 people, right? 350,000 people in 150 cities. And we haven't had one episode of misbehavior from anybody in the audience, except for one person who stood up in some city and had a few, rebellious things to say. But that person wasn't a partisan of mine by any stretch of the imagination. The lectures have been very, very peaceful, and they're very, very positive. And that's part of the reason why I've been able to travel around so regularly over the last year with my wife and do 150 lectures, because it's quite, demanding, all that traveling and all that thinking, because each of the lectures is different, at least to the degree that I can make it. But they're so positive, and it's so exciting at a fundamental level to see people want to engage in serious dialogue of that sort, that it's unbelievably sustaining. Let's call it that. It makes up for the energy use.